That's straight up broken. Yeah, this hero hasn't felt the same after the last patch. It's like they're targeting me with these patch notes. Why are they not following the meta? You only won because your character takes no skill. This gun, dog water. Unplayable. Now, how many times have you heard any of those phrases before? Or even uttered them yourself? The balancing of mechanics in video games has been a struggle since the very beginning, and the more games continue to evolve, the more complicated balancing becomes. And with competitive multiplayer games being the top genre, balancing has become one of the most constructive yet controversial topics in gaming. In this episode of GameSpeak, I would like to go over the aspects of balancing from both a development and player perspective, as well as what methods are used when balancing single and multiplayer games. So without further ado, let's get right into it. If you were tasked with balancing a first-person shooter, what would your top priorities be? Would it be how much damage do the guns do? How much health should I give my characters? How will maps affect character interaction? And while those are all excellent answers, it all boils down to one basic question. Is my game broken? Dan Felder writes in his Game Developers article, "You know your game is broken the same way you know your printer is broken. It isn't working the way you want it to. If a printer's casing is broken but still prints, it isn't broken, it's just damaged. It's only broken when it stops printing at an acceptable quality. When you're designing a game, you naturally want to create a positive experience for your players. When your gameplay isn't providing that experience, your game is broken." Dan then gives the example of one of his personal projects, Varia, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, a strategic fantasy card game. He then explains a scenario where two players are in the middle of a match. It is currently player one's turn. They draw their card. Immediately after drawing, they play it right away, as the card they drew instantly lets them win the game, leaving player two in the dust. Now, obviously, this is a very extreme and unfair scenario. An instant win card like this takes all the creativity out of the game, like deck building, counterplay, and just boils the game down to one strategy. Look for the instant win card. If you had other cards in your hand that could also give you an advantage, but also holding the instant win card, then all the other cards become useless. GG's, bitch, I got the instant win card. Skill issue. You get the point. That's not to say every card needs to be the exact same strength when compared to each other. Having elements in your game that vary in strength and adaptability encourages strategy. Imagine if you were playing a game of chess and all your pieces were pawns. Sure, there's some level of thought, but nowhere near as much as trying to counterplay the movement of a rook or knight with your own selection of game pieces. But finding that sweet spot between balanced and broken is the tough part. Which leads me to another one of Felder's topics, the power curve. Felder describes this curve as forming a simple core formula. How much power should you get in relation to how much resources you invest? Say you're playing a JRPG, and you have a mana system that lets you cast spells. This power curve would be based around how much mana you spend to increase the damage of your spell. Now let's take a look at something a bit more complicated, a fighting game. Or in this case, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, because it's the fighting game I know the best. And we'll be looking at the character, Joker. This character is a great example because Joker has one of the best visual representations of the power curve in this game, and it's all centered around this meter. When this meter is filled, Joker summons a powerful spirit known as Arsene, giving his attacks a boost in power and even changes some of his abilities, but only for a short time. Once the meter is depleted, the spirit goes away, and the cycle starts again. The only way the meter can be filled is by waiting, taking damage, or absorbing attacks via Rebel Guard. Now let's take a look at Smash Bros. In its most competitive form. Most tournament rule sets revolve around a set of competitive stages with players having 3 lives and a 7-minute time limit. The last player standing, or with the least damage taken during the match, wins. So now taking what we know, let's formulate a power curve using Joker's abilities and the rules of the game. To get the most out of Joker, the resources we must use are time and risk. Time to give the meter to charge, and risk being the potential damage we take or absorb with Rebel Guard. Once Arsene is unleashed, the curve works vice versa. Now we only have a limited amount of time to be assisted by Arsene, as the meter slowly drains and any damage we take only makes it drop faster, and thus the repetitive cycle of Arsene management. In short, the time we spend and the risk we take affect how much we can get out of Joker's true potential when using Arsene, making the character balanced. In theory, One of the many things any developer and player needs to accept when it comes to balancing games is that you can't please everybody. There's always going to be phases where a game feels like it benefits someone else more than the other, be it mechanics or skill. It's not like a single player experience, where your challenges all function in patterns that can be beat by learning the game. Balancing environments versus balancing people are two completely different ballgames. When it comes to balancing in single player games, you're looking at player versus environment, and this consists of many things: the level design, the enemies you fight, and even your character's abilities and equipment. Celia Wager writes, "Balance in a single-player context typically means balance between the options the player has, so they're used in roughly equal proportions. So if you have 5 weapons, you want a balance between them, so they each have a moment where they're useful. This can mean giving options each their own unique utility, their own thing they're best at, but also regulating how often more powerful and less powerful options are used. If options aren't balanced in single-player games, then they become all about doing the same thing all the time." Let's take a look at Doom Eternal. One of the main things the devs focused on when creating this game was the weapon management, because in Doom 2016, bro, those micro missiles were stupid broken. One of the main problems of 2016 was that other weapons felt useless compared to the rest of the arsenal, so they reworked it. The ammo count was reduced, certain weapons worked better for hitting enemy weak spots than others, and they gave Doom Guy more tools, like the Flame Belch, Ice Grenade, and Chainsaw. I mean, the chainsaw was also in 2016, but no one ever used it. These tools gave players the ability to further manipulate fights to their advantage and farm for resources. But you couldn't use these tools all the time, so you had to also rely on your weapon knowledge and choose what gun would work best for that instant, and what you could use in place of that weapon when you inevitably run out of ammo for it. Even in hybrid titles like Helldivers 2, the game emphasizes the stratagems you and your team equip before launching into the fray. You're constantly thinking of your next move and the choices you make during the heat of battle. But even then, you can't please everyone. Speaking of not pleasing everyone, it's time to go to the baby zone and look at balancing multiplayer games. Oh boy, where to begin? Multiplayer games are a bit of a minefield. Rather than trying to balance one player versus the AI, you're balancing one player against what could be hundreds of thousands of other players. So how do you convince them and yourself that the game is balanced? You give them options. No matter the game, you should always give the player lots of meaningful choices presented with enough in-game context so that players can form strategies. These are called viable options. Serlin writes, "If an expert player can consistently beat other players just by doing one move or one tactic, we have to call that game imbalanced because there aren't enough viable options. Such a game might have thousands of options, but we only care about the meaningful ones. If those thousands of options all accomplish the same thing, or nothing, or all lose to the dominant move mentioned above, then they are not meaningful options. They just get in the way and add the worst kind of complexity to the game. Complexity that makes the game harder to learn, yet no more interesting to play." This quote says a lot. Whenever your options are compromised so bad to the point you're resorting to playing in one specific style, it discourages players from wanting to learn the game, putting the game at risk of becoming stale. This doesn't mean that all options need to have the same impact. There just needs to be enough for players to find counter options. Though try as you might, there will always be strategies in multiplayer games that yield better results than others. And this brings about the big scary word that has divided multiplayer games for years: meta. The strict definition of meta game comes from an old Greek prefix meta, which means beyond from this perspective. The meaning of meta in gaming refers to the game beyond the game. Meta in gaming means stepping outside of what is directly experienced within the match and looking at the wider context. In simple terms, meta usually refers to broader strategies which are seen as the best. And in most cases, this is decided by the community. Meta is both a blessing and a curse. On one end, metagaming holds the greatest opportunity for a game to evolve, as the dev teams can shift the way the game works based off the most popular strategies, characters, and weapons. Having a consistently evolving meta is very beneficial for a game's longevity, as it shifts the skill pools, causing players to constantly learn new mechanics and how to adapt to their changes. This also makes it easier for newer players to join the fun, as the shifting of skill pools allows them to learn alongside the veteran players. On the darker side of things, meta also brings toxicity into the game space. If someone on your team isn't utilizing the best loadouts or characters when playing, it potentially increases the chances of losing the match. I get it, no one likes to lose, but not everyone likes to play the way you do. It's more of a psychological area, which would be great for another episode, so subscribe and let me know in the comments if you'd like to see an episode on that. Okay, back on track. What can also define a multiplayer's game's balance, or meta, is what type of symmetry it has. If it's a symmetric game, then all players will start with the same perks and abilities. One of the best symmetric game modes lies in the Halo series, specifically SWAT mode. Both teams have the same weapons and health, no power weapons spawn on the map, no shields, and no radar. All that matters is how well you can land those headshots. And sure, you could argue that the map could offer specific teams an advantage depending on armor color and spawn location, but even the most symmetric game, chess, where everything is mirrored perfectly, isn't perfectly symmetric. And it's because white always moves first, so black will always play in reaction to white, just like the red and blue teams play in reaction to first spawn. An asymmetric game gives players more freedom of choice of their abilities before entering a match. Let's take a look at Gigantic. Each character in the game has their own strengths and weaknesses, yet despite each being different, they all have the same chances to beat each other in battle. It's all up to the player and how they utilize their abilities as well as their teams. Some heroes act as tanks, made to absorb damage and lead the charge. Other heroes are assassins, glass cannons that are insanely fast and can deal massive damage, but can die just as quickly. Other characters act as supports, keeping their team healed in the heat of battle, but can also fight back if needed, but not very well. It's the mix of all of these asymmetric traits that keep the game balanced. For every move the home team makes, it's just as possible for the enemy team to form a counterattack. So the viable options you present a player, be it symmetric or asymmetric, can determine what can make a multiplayer game balance. Choices like what hero to play, what route to choose when navigating a map, and what abilities to utilize when facing your opponent. Every choice made should feel impactful to the player, be it good or bad. Each decision made will help players formulate strategies, create drama, and test their skills, making the game feel more satisfying. Or you could just play Helldive and get your shit rocked. Thank you so much for watching this episode of GameSpeak. Let me know what you thought in the comments below, and also suggest any idea you may have for future episodes. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of my new videos. Thanks again, everyone. Bye!